Hi, Simon. How have you been this week?
Yeah, good, thanks.
You been up to anything exciting or just waiting for taxes?
That's a bit of a low blow. So for our listeners, I was late today because I was waiting for a long time for a taxi, and Tim clearly finds this ridiculously amusing.
Well, it's normally me that's late, isn't it? So,
True,
It's got to be the other way around. Well, I've been at something called Planets Day today, where I've been talking to earth scientists, physicists, astronomers about early life on Earth. So sort of following up on our previous podcast that we did a little while ago. So, and if the listeners haven't listened to that, they need to subscribe.
Yep. Have a look at the links below, folks.
Yeah. Anyway, today we're in person. We've got a couple of guests and we're going to be talking about domestication. Do you have any domestic animals?
I do. I've got cats, but a cat now. But I like all domestic animals really. And we all know you have Woofler.
I have Woofler, and I had some lamb for tea. Talking about domestication.
Apologies to all listening vegetarians and everyone else, just for Tim.
Anyway, should we introduce our guests?
Yeah, well, let them introduce themselves, perhaps.
Let's go for it.
Hi, I'm Gregor.
Say a little bit more. So we know you're Gregor, but the listeners have no idea who you are.
I'm Gregor Larson. I'm in the School of Archaeology here at the University of Oxford. And I do evolutionary genomics and domestic animals, primarily.
And I'm Lachlan. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in Gregor's lab, so basically the Robin equivalent to Batman. I guess Batman was babysitting Robin, I don't know. And I do a whole bunch of research on dogs as well, as part of Gregor's lab.
Well, neither of you sounds very English. I have to say, I'm loving the accents. Where are you from?
Lachlan sounds English to me.
Really?
I've been told this before. No, I'm from New Zealand. Yeah.
So domestication. Humanity's domesticated a lot of species over the years. What do we think the first one to go was? What was the first species that we domesticated?
Well, hands down, the dog. The dog has the longest relationship with us. And I guess you can see that when you walk around the street today in terms of how ubiquitous they are throughout the whole of the world. But that relationship started sometime 20 upwards to 40,000 years ago, depending on who you talk to. Depending on who you talk to.
Yeah, but
I don't want to rule out the science of
other
other scientists, you know. It's not all geneticists, you know. Yeah, so there's archaeological dogs that people find that kind of look a little bit different to wolves, but those have been ruled out based on most genomic studies. But I guess the current estimate is around 20,000 years, which is what, it's like 10, 15,000 years earlier than anything else. No, sheep and goat. Yeah, around 12.
So yeah, a lot of your domestic animals that we're used to eating, a lot of the pig, sheep, goat, cattle, 10, 11-ish, something like that. So dogs precede that by quite some time.
Wow. And that's remarkable because you can imagine that the other animals you talked about, we eat them, right? But I guess we haven't ever been eating dogs.
It's a really dynamic, and this is the whole point of domestication really, is it's about relationships. And those relationships shift in time and space. And there are cultures that eat dogs today.
I was going to say the chow chow, famously the Chinese edible dog, you know, that was used for eating by a lot of East Asian cultures.
And there are animals that you and I would eat, like pigs, that are considered taboo in other cultures.
Yeah.
So, you know, what gets eaten and what doesn't is very culturally specific in both time and space, and it shifts a lot.
So it changes in time too.
Absolutely, yeah. And the other fun thing is that, you know, people don't have a problem eating a lot of chickens. In fact, it's the #1 meat on Earth now, having overtaken pork. And yet, for the first at least 500, 700 years of chicken's association with people, nobody ate them. So the chicken domestication thing is a very interesting situation where initially, it's certainly by the time it arrives in Europe, it spends 500 years mostly being revered and mostly being buried with people for whom those are their chickens, and they're presented as grave goods, and they're in the human graves and everything else, and nobody's consuming them. In fact, nobody's eating many of the eggs either. So the kind of classic idea of like, and what Tim led off with was humans domesticated animals. No, we didn't really. I feel like that phrasing suggests that we are very much in charge of this, that it was forethought, we knew what we were doing, and it was a very good idea, and humans are smart people who go out and do things intentionally. And I'm not sure that's how it works.
Especially given the first domesticate was a dog. I don't think anybody in their right mind would have been walking around thinking, you know, that wolf, that's going to look really nice sat in front of my fire wearing a party hat one day.
And we can eat it.
Yeah, that too.
So, okay, given you know, it wasn't deliberate. How did it happen? How did the first wolf become domesticated, so to speak? What's the process?
Yeah, nobody knows. I think that's fair to say.
Go on, have a stab, Lockie. You're looking like you've got an idea.
So everybody's got an idea about this. What I think is really interesting is the way in which people phrase these ideas and the kinds of questions they're seeking to answer. Mm-hmm. So one issue that you have with wolves is that it is apparently, it's competing with us on a landscape initially. So it's similar pack animal, similar hunting strategies, and there might have been a fair degree of knowledge of, but also suspicion of those two taxa.
Yeah.
So one of the questions that you have to try and answer is that if you have a wolf population that starts to become more closely associated with people, you've got a gene flow problem, right? Because any change that people are going to initiate, however deliberately, that then starts to manifest itself in that population that will then become dogs, those animals are not so closely associated with people that they would resist gene flow with wolves that are elsewhere on the landscape. So how do you overcome that hump? And what a lot of people have said then is like, oh, well, what you just do is you grab some wolf pups and you bring them back and you suckle them and then you rear them as domestic tamed animals. And therefore that initiates it. It solves the gene flow problem immediately because you sever that relationship with the wild population. And you've got dogs in about 20 seconds, which also feeds into our idea of how change happens. We're very bad at long-term slow change. We're very good at instant stuff. And so that's how we assume the whole thing happened. But that's one idea. And I don't buy into that, but I like that is solving a problem of gene flow that otherwise still exists.
So okay, so that's the idea. How do you go about sort of proving or disproving that idea?
Well, that's the beauty of a how question, is that you can't. And so therefore everybody can have a very strong opinion predicated on no evidence whatsoever. But Lucky, you were about to say something with how.
I'm just aware that I'm in striking distance of you if I say something.
No, but you're here to tell us the truth, Lockie.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm exposing it all. No, I'm in the same boat as Gregor. I think it is a complex thing to try and answer these how questions. But there are some good, I guess, hypotheses that are put forward by people. One of my favorites is the idea that you start to get people and wolves in close proximity and they start becoming, I guess, more and more comfortable having each other in one another's spaces. And whether that's attraction due to being pushed into some sort of refugia during a glacial period, or because you start getting an accumulation of waste and then they're scavenging and you're over generations selecting inadvertently for the more tamer of the wolves, because those are the ones that are tolerated around human settlements. If they're not going to eat your child, you're probably going to let that one live a little bit longer than one that'll take away your family.
So could a lot of it just be that rather than get any kind of benefit from each other, no danger from each other?
I think that's your first thing. I mean, you have to have a thin edge of the wedge and then other things happen. So for me, like with chickens, the first association seems to be people move into peninsular Southeast Asia with a dry rice agricultural basis, which has a particular ecology around it, which then mimics the bamboo that was in the area that the chickens are very attracted to. So it becomes a magnet that chickens then are drawn into a human settlement. People then get associated with those chickens and start moving with them, but there was no direct intentionality. Nobody's climbing a tree to grab a chicken and then dragging it halfway across Eurasia to get to Europe. And even when they do that, after they get to Eurasia, nobody's eating them. So it's the classic Gouldian problem, right? Where what we tend to do is equate current utility with historical origin. And when you do that with domestication, you end up making ridiculous stories about how we domesticated chicken to do what we are currently doing with chickens, which is eating them, which is clearly not the case. And I suspect exactly the same thing is true of every plant and every animal, where the association starts off in one way and then metastasizes into weird processes where now we start emphasizing the thing that we're currently doing over what was happening in the past.
Makes you wonder about the first person to bite into a chicken then, right? They're these revered birds and someone thinks,
I suppose,
hey, you know what?
but people have been, eating each other, right? Like,
there's a pleasant thought.
I just mean it's not so weird if there's other things happening, right? So, yeah.
So we can make up any stories we want then. So
Sure.
I could basically say, actually, the first step on domestication was a couple of kids that got raised by wolves.
Why not? And the best part is you don't have to prove it. That's the best part about, and what I love about domestication particularly is that you said you had cats, right?
Yes.
We can say this, we just had a paper rejected at a journal because the editor had a very strong opinion about the existence of cats in the Neolithic in Europe. And this just continues in a vein where domestication is great because we punch above our weight often with where we can publish, because people go, ooh, a dog or a cat. So we don't have, our science can be half as good as everybody else's, and we can still publish in high profile journals. That's the upside. The downside is that everybody already knows how dogs and cats were domesticated because they've got one at home and they will tell you that's what happened. And so it's a real double-edged sword when you're working on animals that are so familiar to so many people.
So I was interested in something Lachie said earlier about the genetic aspect, you know, sort of doing genetic analysis. And we had a podcast earlier where we were talking, you know, with Oxford Nanopore Tech. And so, you know, I think our listeners are familiar with the concepts of genes and sequencing. So I think what may be less familiar is this concept that you can dig something up from, you know, many, many years ago and still extract genetic material from that.
Yeah. We would love Oxford Nanopore to be applicable to ancient DNA. Just plug it into the computer and then everything goes. But yeah, like you said, you're going out and you're collaborating with archaeologists who are working in all manner of places around the world, recovering these just all sorts of fragments of bones and tools and things like that you can then sequence DNA from. And the process there is similar to what you would process for like a normal tissue or blood sample or something like that, but a lot more kit. You look like you're about to break bad. You know, you're going in full body suit, covered up to try and protect the sample from you. There's nothing dangerous about a 10, 20,000-year-old bone. It's you that's the real risk here. And then we sequence these things and then try and reconstruct them based on a picture that we don't really have. You know, it's like trying to make a jigsaw when you've got half of the pieces and you're using a different box as a model for what you're trying to reconstruct.
And so the idea there is, so you're saying that the danger, you don't want to contaminate it. That's what you're trying to say, right?
Of course, yeah. But that's also hard because people in archaeological digs, you know, you're working in hot places. You're not going to be wearing clean suits the whole time.
Of course.
So there's a lot of precautions we have to take once the sample gets into the lab to try and mitigate some of those problems that have already happened before the sample got to us.
And so what kind of things have we learnt about domestication of dogs from genetic analysis of old bones, etc.?
Well, we're setting bounds, I think. We're trying to answer who, where, when, how many times, and maybe use those to establish a how, or at least set up a scenario for how that fits within those relevant lines of data. So where? What do you think?
What do I think?
East Oxford.
Without giving too much away. I like the idea because I was saying before about you need a mechanism whereby dogs and wolves wolves and humans come into close proximity with one another. And I think glacier refugia, so these areas that are ice-free, that wolves and humans would have both been stuck in for extended periods of time and possibly interacting with one another. So, I don't know, Spain, Italy, I like those as candidates.
And but also Siberia has been mentioned in all of this, and partly because the when question, our bounds are getting better. We know we certainly have dogs at 15, easy, 15,000. And there hasn't been any dogs demonstrated very clearly that have even been inferred from genetic sequences, time to most recent common ancestor of mitochondrial lineages, for example, that goes back earlier than about 25. So we've got about a 10,000 year period between 15 and 25.
So when you say dogs, I just want to be clear, you mean when dogs, as we know them now, emerge?
Yes.
Right, so before that it was wolves.
Yes.
And then at some point there's a slow, or what you know, whether it's slow or not, I guess we don't know, but it's transition into the animal that we now know as a dog.
And then you've exactly hit on that problem there, right? That transitional period of like wolfy dog, you know, drawing the line between what is a wolf and what is a dog in those early stages with genetics is going to be particularly tricky, which may be one of the reasons why we haven't found them, or we're just missing the individuals themselves.
There's a really fun question too, regarded to how many times. Because are you thinking two completely separate, genomically and geographically separated wolf populations that go through a similar process to become dogs? Or do dogs emerge from a single wolf population and then that dog population has some gene flow with wolves that themselves were not involved in that original process? And I'm curious to know what Lachie thinks about that too, given...
Yeah, it's quite interesting because what you do see with dogs and wolves is based on their nuclear genome, you know, so all of the components of their chromosomes, they are completely separate when you look at it as a whole. But when you look at their mitochondria, so their DNA they inherit through the maternal line, there's at least 5 different groups.
That are paraphyletic.
That are paraphyletic, which means they each have wolves at the base, right? So there's clearly been some complex interaction between dogs and wolves throughout history that has led to some of the diversity we see in dogs today. Whether that explains it all or just a component, we don't quite know yet.
So is domestication just a form of mutualism?
Yeah.
And is it possible then that, so I've just come back reasonably recently from South Africa where we saw an amazing sight actually. It was a crocodile and a stork fishing together, right? And they worked their way along the side of this waterhole, and in very close proximity, the crocodile would kind of form and make a trap almost for these little fish. The stork would go in and get some and then chase the fish up towards the crocodile's mouth. It'd turn on its side and eat them. Now that sort of, is it possible that humans and dogs could have hunted together? Because you could imagine that would be an incredibly effective way of a sort of domestic, of a mutualism starting.
I love the exploration of mutualisms as a way to come up with these hypotheses, because what nobody does outside of a human context with respect to mutualism is wonder who domesticated who.
Yeah, well, that's
right. That's the thing. So nobody goes, oh, that crocodile was clearly leading the way and training that bird what to do. And yet every single animal that's in association with us, that's the first question we ask. And I think because of that, we're no closer to understanding the origins because we're asking the wrong damn questions, right? If we were to perceive this as a mutualism, we would start to ask those kinds of questions, because perhaps a kind of a co-hunting thing pops up in exactly that scenario. Or what a colleague of ours was suggesting yesterday is a kind of sentinel thing. Like if you have this a population of wolves and people, and they are both equally vested in something, and the wolves then don't want other wolf packs to take advantage of this human population, that they are the ones nearby, then anybody else that comes around, they can start howling, then the people go, ah, okay, now we're aware, we're more for, and now you're kind of looking at each other like we're partners in crime here. This is what we're doing together. And you fall into that rather than being deliberately acted upon by very smart people in the Paleolithic.
So I read, thinking along those lines, I recently read a book called 10 Birds That Changed the World. Fantastic book. You should read it. And one of the bits in there is one of the chapters is about a raven. And it starts with this woman saying, this raven saved my life. It was squawking. It was making a lot of noise. And then I saw this mountain lion. And, you know, the raven clearly warned me of the mountain lion. And then the author points out, no, the raven was almost certainly alerting the mountain lion to the woman, which it would kill, and then the raven might get some scraps. And, I mean, we don't, you know, very anecdotal, but I mean, it kind of fits into the story that you're saying.
Absolutely. Or like pilot fish and sharks, right? Yeah. Nobody really knows, as far as I'm aware of this, how the pilot fish and the shark get associated with one another. Now, did the pilot fish domesticate the shark or vice versa? But we're not asking those questions. And I would say the same thing for the whole ant agriculture thing. Like we start using terms like agriculture and we place upon it this heavily loaded word, which implies a top-down human-initiated goal-directed thing. And the ants are doing this too. And nobody goes, well, which ant decided to protect the aphids by clearing out the leaves to get the young? It just starts getting ugly very quickly. So we're good at making these analogies, but we're less good at applying those concepts of mutualism to us when thinking about ourselves as biological organisms rather than as brainy humans who must determine everything we do.
I guess none of these things are perhaps mutually exclusive either, right? Something could have happened in one part of the world and then it flips. So once they say the dog domesticates the man in one part of the world, the man domesticates the dog in another part of the world, and eventually we end up with a sort of a complicated, huge ecosystem.
I suppose, but even that framing kind of bugs me because it's the same thing. Like the verb to domesticate automatically implies somebody actively doing something to somebody else, right?
Sure.
And that's the whole thing. So you've got cats, right? And so many people have come up to me and gone, well, the cats clearly domesticated people, you know, and it's like, we don't allow, therefore there's no middle ground. We don't allow for the space in which you have a true mutualism, which is the two organisms simply coming together without anybody making a conscious decision about what's actually happening, at least for a long term, if not in a sort of day-to-day process.
But you do see a breakdown of that relationship in some cases, though, where these domestic animals that were once under our control, you know, that then escape and then reestablish as wild populations. Think of the dingoes in Australia. You know, they arrived as dogs. Well, they still are dogs, but that's
the terminology
that could get me in a lot of trouble back home. So if anybody's listening from that part of the world, so they arrived in the region about 5,000 years ago. And then
is that all? Okay. Oh wow.
Very recent.
I think it's less.
Wow.
The earliest evidence we have for dingoes in southern Australia is about 3,300 years.
Gosh.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
it's very.
And there's a whole lot of relationships they have with people. Some, like Aboriginal groups, have absolutely no relationship with dingoes whatsoever. Others use them in ways of society that we would like have akin to ourselves and things like that. Yeah.
So, but then I guess other species, it's kind of perhaps, particularly food species, so things like pigs. I know, Gregor, you've done work on domestication of pigs in the past. Is that a slightly different process rather than a mutualism? Because we're just like, yeah, let's go and eat that. That's tasty. Oh, bacon.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. So it's interesting because a lot of the evidence from pigs, certainly early on, again, suggests what has been termed more of a commensal route, where you get a very slow process of effectively pigs being attracted to people rather than the other way around. So if you have more or less settled agricultural communities, there's a whole bunch of stuff, and the pigs are smart and they're opportunistic, and they can adapt so quickly to whatever environment is given. And so they will very rapidly take advantage of whatever human circumstances are providing them with some kind of resource. And so, a very good friend and colleague of mine has said, if you really want to change animal behavior, you just have to feed it. And she's got a grant, it's Naomi Sykes at Exeter, where she's got a grant called Do Not Feed the Animals, where everything that we think we know about what to feed animals is completely wrong. And you can see massive changes in behavior, in morphology, in tooth shape, and everything just by the act of feeding them something completely different. And I suspect that and we're seeing a lot of dog domestication research is now looking into questions about dietary isotopes and to see when is the point at which people are, the dietary isotopes, the people are matching that of what would the canids. In other words, can you see that process of if they're eating the same thing, they're probably sharing the same space, and there's mutualism, domestication, whatever you want to call that, but you're going to see that much more rarely on a day-to-day, generation-to-generation basis with dietary isotopes than you are with the genetics, which is a much deeper change that's happening in
Gregor,
the genome.
can I just stop you a second? Can you explain dietary isotopes for our
Sure,
listeners?
as best I can. This is not my forte. Lucky, you want to take it?
I'm tapping out as well.
Using these big words, you got caught out.
Yeah, so you are what you eat. And so you can measure the proportions of carbon isotopes within the bones or remains of hair and tissue of an organism, and then work out where you are on a trophic level and what you're eating. And that will change if you're weaning, it will change if you're eating C4 plants, it will change. So from looking at the ratios of carbon and nitrogen and other isotopes as well within skeletal remains, you can then place and say, do the dogs have the same isotopic levels, values as the people do? And people have used this as a way to try to say, look, these two things are eating the same thing. And one thing you can do that is, like, if you are in a partnered relationship and you're living in the same house, what is the likelihood that you and your partner have exactly the same dietary isotope? Because you're eating the same thing the whole time. So and when you think of it like that, it's like, yeah, if you're sharing space and sharing resources and sharing food, that's a pretty nice proxy then for that relationship, which ultimately is what we're trying to figure out.
So I guess we should just say here, for people not aware of perhaps even what isotopes are, then it's just different. So elements like carbon, nitrogen, they can exist with slightly different masses. Chemically, they're the same, but the masses will be slightly different. And we know they exist in different ratios in different scenarios. So it's knowing those ratios that we use to distinguish, right?
Yeah. And if you don't know that and you're watching this, great. Like, welcome.
Yeah, for sure.
And on the same topic of like the whole management thing and the use of isotopes, there's a whole bunch of other important isotopes based on local geology and hydrology. You can pinpoint where an individual's from based on strontium and oxygen isotopes and things like that. And that's one of the things that they use in these sites where there's possible evidence of early stages of domestication, where you're looking at, are these individuals staying in the lowlands, or are they moving between the highlands and the lowlands based on changes in their isotopic signatures through life? So are they following what you'd expect based on a natural population or a human managed population? So there's a whole bunch of interesting questions.
What's really fun about that too is that rather than just getting a single bulk isotope over the lifetime of an organism, you can serial sample teeth. So you can see basically an organism's movement on almost a monthly basis over its entire life.
Wow.
So that's what's amazing. And then Kate Britton has been doing a lot, as amongst a lot of other people as well. And you can see herds of reindeer staying in one place, moving for a couple of months to another place, and then coming back again. And so you're actually witnessing real-time dispersal and migration patterns of organisms that existed 15, 20, 30,000 years ago.
So when archaeologists dig me up in 500 years, they're going to see, oh, he started in New Zealand and then made his way to Oxford.
Assuming there's enough of you left to sample, yeah, they'll be able to do it.
It'll be all that port. He must have spent some time in Oxford, clearly in a college somewhere.
Or the snuff, maybe? The snuff is like eroding your nasal passages.
But so the animals that we've domesticated
Careful.
also leave we formed mutualisms.
There we go.
Have also left genetic signatures in us, right? So, for example, if you're looking at in Northern Europe, there's a lot of lactose tolerance. There's a less so in Southeast Asia, where cattle weren't domesticated in the same way in Northern Europe. Is that correct, or have I?
Yeah,
there's a few things.
That. Yeah.
So there are 2 independent cattle domestications. The first thing, one of them is in Asia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So there's 2 independent cattle, Indocene and Taurine cattle. And the other thing.
But they didn't. Did they use them for milk? For dairy products?
I'm not
in South Asia, they definitely did, but were they taurine or I think
Indocene and
they were Indocene in South Asia? Or no, sorry, in the Gulf, I'm thinking.
Oh, I don't know.
I have to look into it. That's a good question.
Okay.
Whether Indocene cattle were used for milk. Totally possibly.
But
I would not rule it out.
One of the interesting things you see with the emergence of lactase persistence, so this enzyme that helps you break down milk, it doesn't appear with the earliest evidence of milk in pottery sherds and things like that you see in the archaeological record. So people are suffering through it by eating dairy products.
Cheese.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So they're relying on these natural processes that will break down those the lactase on its own. So that happens a lot where you've got this hypothesis where we look at a population today and we come up with some idea based on the frequency of certain genes. So in dogs in particular, there's this gene that encodes the ability to digest starch. And people think as soon as dogs were with agriculturalists, there must have been a massive increase in the copy number of that gene. Yeah. And for the most part, it fits. But there's cases where hunter-gatherers have dogs that have a huge amount of copy numbers of these genes. So it's not a one-size-fits-all rule. And I think the same applies to these lactase persistence stories.
And the lactase persistence is also, there's a lot of genomic gene flow as well as ways in which genes rise and fall in relative proportion within a population that has more to do with than just selection. And because you've got the size of the population, you've got bottlenecks, and then you've also got populations that are, it's a high frequency, moving into a place and then mating with people locally, which then makes it look like they are acquiring it through just evolution, when in fact they're acquiring it through gene flow. So it's a lot of the early stories are turning out to be a hell of a lot more complex than people initially guessed, which is not a terrible surprise, right? So
and there's about 3 variants depending on where you are in the world that
6,
actually.
Actually.
Oh wow,
yeah.
There you go. 6
there's a bunch in Africa. There's a number in South Asia. So it's been happened upon a number of times independently, and all of those have had some degree of positive selection, but it's the one in Europe that people are most familiar with simply because the data set's much bigger.
And so where does domestication science go from here? What are the next kind of big questions that we do? Because it sounds like there's going to be a lot of questions that are going to be impossible to answer by the sounds of it. We can come up with some hypotheses about how, dog domestication started, or that mutualism started. We've come up with a couple of ideas when we're chatting here. They're probably not going to be testable without a time machine or something. So what are the big questions in domestication science now?
Well, I'll let Lachlan go first because I've got an idea, but...
No, I'll let you go first.
Sure?
Yeah, I'm struggling to think of. I mean, a lot of the questions.
Not struggling too hard.
I guess a lot of the questions that were the target of early days domestication, ancient DNA research in particular, was where, when, probably trying to get into the why kind of thing. But now that we've kind of narrowed that down, apart from dogs, really, dogs is still the one that's kind of anywhere in Eurasia is the point at which dogs could have been domesticated, and the time period, who knows. So I guess we're going to have to adapt into what people look into with ancient DNA, and I think that's what Kruger's about.
No, for me, it's a lot about framing of the questions, getting out of this headspace that people did this, and therefore, and Lachlan just said why, right? Why were things domesticated? And for me, already that's problematic because that presumes there was a rationale, that presumes a human actor, rather than a how question asked the same thing, but doesn't come to it with that baggage of people having to do this with some degree of intention. What I'm more interested in exploring right now, though, is something we hit upon earlier, and Lachlan and I have some discussions about this, although it's because right now, genomically, when we look at the nuclear genome, we have dogs on one side of a PCA and wolves on another, and there is an ocean's worth of space between the two.
Oh, really?
Oh,
with the exception of people that messed around in the 1950s making wolf dog.
Yeah. So Sarloos and Czechoslovakian wolf dogs, and there's a handful of others too. But what's brilliant about that is that when we plot those, they're smack in the middle. right? And we can get a very good estimate from what we were talking about before about sequencing and how that's been very useful in ancient DNA, is demonstrating the degree of hybridization, gene flow between populations, domestic populations, and other organisms that were not involved in a domestication process. And Lachlan did a brilliant paper review a couple of years ago where showing that you can get pigs that are 100%, where they just take in all the wild ancestry possible. They're just out there shagging everything. Whereas dogs and wolves, apparently not so much. And then you get everything on the spectrum in between. So every animal's got its own story about how resistant or how attracted it is and how frequent the gene flow is between themselves and a wild organism that's out there. So related to that is we have dogs on one side, wolves on another side. Where do we think the first dog would be? Like, and that early population, if we're set in this dichotomy, and we do this all the time, we're seeing the same thing now with ferrets. We can't find the first ferret. We got polecats everywhere, but everything that's being called a ferret is not a ferret. It's just not there. We're finding the same thing with rabbits. We found the same thing for a while with chickens. Like when we have this dichotomy in our heads, it therefore almost weirdly prevents us from being able to interpret or to see that moment of initiation. And I don't quite know how we get around that, but
It's also difficult because it's all part of taphonomy, which is basically like the ability of something to be preserved through time. You know, in the early days where these things start from small populations, the chances of that preserving are a lot lower than something preserving when it's spread in every culture all around the world. So it does become a bit of a needle in a haystack search, you know. I think that's what we are missing for some of the dog stuff. It's just that one individual that we're going to find one day. Someone's going to dig out of a cave and send to us in an envelope.
Maybe. I mean, the crazy thing about dogs is it looks like a lot of this is happening at about the LGM, which... A little funny story.
LGM?
LGM, right. Thanks for asking, Tim. When I was a PhD student, we had a meeting, and one of my first meetings in the lab, and the three-letter acronym LGM got thrown around probably 30 or 40 times. And I was sitting next to a master's student. And the master's student I saw over my shoulder had written in a notebook LGM. And then she went back to her desk first. I stuck around with some people. And then as I came back, I walked by her, and she was on a website, and it was like something like... acronym exploder or something like this, where she had typed in LGM to find out what we'd been talking about because she was too scared to raise her hand and say, "Excuse me, you said LGM 35,000 times. I don't know what that is." And the very first result for LGM was little green men, which was hilarious because clearly we were not talking about Martians, but and she must have been completely confused at that point of like, what are these guys actually talking about? So last glacial maximum is what we were talking about then, is what I mean now. And that's a period between 18 and 21,000 years ago, was the last period of time when you had a glaciation that was huge. Sea levels dropped 120 meters because it all got locked up in ice. Where we are right now is under 2 kilometers of ice. The shorelines were pushed out, in some cases 10 kilometers, tens of kilometers, depending on where you are. So, and weirdly, it's right about that time when a lot of our direct radiocarbon dates and presumed dates from our phylogenies are showing up around this dog wolf human thing. And what's really
refugia stuff.
That's why I like refugia.
But also it's problematic because everything's getting crushed at this point. People leave the UK. There's nobody here. There's nobody here. And wolf populations across Eurasia take an absolute battering. They make it through, but there's many fewer of them. And taphonomically, we can't find them. And it happens. So it's weird because it might have been, you don't want to speculate too much, but it's possible that that's the kind of climactic event that drives this relationship, that forces people and wolves together in a way. But then it also means that the likelihood of us finding it, because the populations are so small, becomes fleeting and disappears from our fingertips. And it's like, ugh, it's just really frustrating.
I suppose one of the interesting things about dogs as well is how our relationship has changed with them over time, particularly in the Western world. I mean, you know, Woofler is unbelievably spoilt dog, but we get something out of him in the fact that, he's kind of friendly. It's someone you can shout at when you're in a bad mood. You can talk to nicely when you're in a good mood. And there's all this research coming out now that shows, how mental health can be improved by spending time with domestic animals, well, some domesticated animals, maybe not Woofler, but, and, how people who take dogs to work have kind of benefits and what have you. So, but presumably that's a relatively new thing, I would have thought, or any thoughts, any ideas?
And also not like just explicitly happening now. I think there's still a range of relationships of dogs and people across the world. You think of free-roaming village dogs. If you're a child, that might be terrifying, whereas if you see a free-roaming golden retriever, that thing is...
That's terrifying, yeah.
The fun thing for me is that if we think about those relationships and that kind of, Woofler is like, he's there because he's friendly and he's like a member of the family. But that if you think about it as a job and you think what dogs excel at more than any other domestic animal is, if we need a job doing, there's a very good chance a dog can do it in a way that a horse can't or a guinea pig can't, right? Like and so you've got bomb dogs, you've got security dogs, you've got racing dogs. If the dog can do something or wants to do something, and Lockie's got this really cool project that he's working on right now, the Turnspit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I was going to touch on that before because we were talking about the change through time, right?
Yeah.
And I guess the explosion of change in dogs in terms of the diversity we see today of little French bulldogs with the smush faces or your massive Irish wolfhounds, that was all a Victorian invention. So before that, dogs were kind of a blend. There were different shapes and sizes, but it wasn't as discrete and standardized as it is today. And that was born out of a lot of eugenics thinking, pretty problematic. You think of purebred bloodlines, those kind of languages that we use around dogs. So that was when they decided that dogs should be this tall, look like this, be this color. But before that, there was a lot of diversity. And what Gregor was saying with the Turnspit was that was a form of dog. It wasn't quite a breed because it wasn't standardized in the same way. But before industrialization, to keep your meat turning over a spit, you'd have children there, turning the spit. But they would complain about burning their fingers. And do you know what doesn't complain? A dog running around a wheel. So they had this dog called a Turnspit that would run around a wheel to keep the meat perfectly cooked and even on all sides. And then with industrialization and mechanization, it went extinct because, surplus to requirement. You don't need this dog anymore. So people weren't keeping them in the same way of like a fancy breed you would now to try and keep it alive. So it kind of just fizzled out of existence.
Gosh.
And that's true hundreds of times.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all kinds of cattle droving dogs. Apparently, apocrypha, probably not real, but that's the story of the wolfhounds in Ireland, where they were so successful at getting all the wolves in Ireland, although there were no wolves in Ireland, but that's another thing, that they were so good at it, then they were surplus to requirement. And then, so the dogs are there all the time looking at us going, what do you need me to do? And we're like, oh, can you alert me when I'm about to have a seizure? Yes, I can do that. Okay, can you go get that duck that I just shot? Yes, I can do that. Whatever it is you need a dog to do, there's a dog available to do it until you don't need it anymore. And then the dog's going, what can I do? And you're like, I don't know, maybe we'll just start eating you now, right? And then we see that happening too with a lot of hunter-gatherer societies where dogs get buried, have unbelievable grave goods, have full burial rights, are treated as like the most important people in those human communities. Agriculturalists move in, and then you find dog bones again, but now they got cut marks on them because they know you don't need that dog to do that job.
You won't get that with cats, right? Cats are thinking, I don't care what you want me to do or need me to do.
Yeah, so there's a great cat story that we're working on right now. It's really
Can you talk about it, or is it embargoed?
We'll save it for next time.
Okay.
It's really fun.
Well, actually, we're running out of time anyway, aren't we, Simon? So thank you guys very much for coming along. That's been fascinating, and
really
I think we'll get you back when you've got a few more, because I think you've got quite a lot.
We got some bombshells coming up.
There's some stuff in the oven. That's really tough.
Yeah.
Well,
hopefully
not
you'll
literally.
No, it's cooking the Turnspit.
Where's Woofler?
The Turnspit dog is making sure that it's cooked on all sides before it's published. So.
No, okay. Well, will you come back at a later date?
We'd love to.
Yeah, of course.
That'd be wonderful.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was great.
I mean, that's amazing, isn't it? I had no idea that, that I think I'd been thinking about domestication all wrong, but I like the idea of it being a mutualism.
Yeah, me too. And I think I'm most taken aback by this idea of dogs having uses, and then when those uses are no longer needed, the dogs disappear. It seems, I guess it stands to reason. I just never thought about it that way before.
And have you trained your cats to do anything?
I don't think you could train our cat to do anything. I mean, he's so timid. If you put a glass of water down and it makes too much of a sound, he runs off. So yeah, no chance.
It sounds like he's won the domestication game now.
Yeah,
at least Woofler does something. Mainly, he just trains Sonia to give him treats, if the truth be told.
Harry looks cute. That's something.
No, that's true. Okay, well, listeners, we'll see you next time.
Okay,
Or
bye.
even hear you.